The first snow of November arrived earlier than anyone in Red Creek expected. By sunset, the narrow streets had disappeared beneath a blanket of white, and the wind carried enough bite to make even the oldest ranch hands hurry indoors. Smoke curled from stone chimneys. Horses stood with lowered heads against the cold, and the warm glow from lantern-lit windows became the only welcoming sight in the little Montana town. At the center of Main Street stood the Whitmore boarding house, a sturdy two-story building with wide front windows and a freshly painted sign that read, Whitmore Boarding House and Dining Hall. Inside, the smell of fresh bread, beef stew, and cinnamon filled the air. Travelers warmed their hands around steaming coffee, while railroad workers finished the last of their evening meals before heading home. Unlike the noisy saloons farther down the street, Clara Whitmore's establishment offered something different, a place where families could eat together, strangers were greeted with respect, and no drunken shouting disturbed the peace. When the last customer paid his bill and stepped into the snowy night, Clara locked the front door behind him with practiced hands. She was 31 years old, taller than many women in town, with chestnut hair tied neatly beneath a simple blue ribbon. Her sleeves were rolled above her elbows, revealing hands marked by honest work instead of delicate gloves. She had spent the last 3 years proving that she could run the boarding house just as well as any man. Most people in Red Creek had stopped questioning her. Some had even started asking her advice. She crossed the dining room, collecting empty plates before carrying them into the kitchen. Every chair was pushed neatly beneath its table. Every lantern was trimmed. Every receipt was placed carefully inside a leather ledger. Numbers had become as familiar to Clara as recipes. Her uncle, Benjamin Whitmore, had taught her both. He had taken her in after her parents died when she was only 10 years old. While other girls learned embroidery and piano, Benjamin had taught Clara how to balance accounts, repair broken fences, negotiate with stubborn suppliers, and recognize dishonest businessmen before they ever opened their mouths. He used to laugh whenever neighbors questioned his methods. A person who owns their own roof, he'd say, should know every nail holding it together. Even after his passing 2 winters earlier, Clara still heard those words whenever she faced another difficult day. She finished wiping the last table when she noticed the old grandfather clock near the staircase. Nearly 9 o'clock, earlier than usual for closing, but the storm had driven everyone home. She was about to extinguish the front lantern when 3 sharp knocks echoed against the door. She frowned. Travelers rarely arrived this late during a snowstorm. Moving cautiously, Clara unlocked the door just enough to look outside. A tall man stood on the porch, snow covering the shoulders of his dark wool coat. Behind him waited a tired bay horse whose breath drifted into the freezing air like smoke. The stranger removed his hat politely. "I hope I'm not too late," he said. His voice was calm, carrying none of the rough confidence she'd grown used to hearing from drifters. "I've been riding since before sunrise." Clara studied him quietly. He looked somewhere around 35. There was nothing flashy about him. His coat had been repaired several times. His boots were worn but clean. A leather saddlebag rested across one shoulder. What caught her attention most wasn't the scar running across the back of his left hand. It was his eyes. Instead of looking directly at the food or the warmth inside, they moved calmly around the entrance, noticing the staircase, the hallway, the windows, and the stable beyond the courtyard before returning to meet hers. Not nervous, simply observant. "You looking for a meal?" Clara asked. "If you're still serving. In a room, if you've got one available." She hesitated only a moment before opening the door wider. "Bring your horse around back. There's an empty stall in the stable." A faint smile crossed his face. "I appreciate that." A few minutes later he returned, brushing snow from his coat before stepping inside. The warmth hit him immediately. "So," Clara said, hanging his coat near the stove, "what'll it be?" He glanced toward the kitchen where fresh bread still rested beneath a cloth. "Whatever's hottest. Stew's still warm. I'll gladly take a bowl. And coffee, if you've got enough left." She poured a steaming cup and placed it in front of him. "No whiskey?" He smiled without looking offended. "I've found warm coffee keeps a man's thoughts clearer than whiskey ever could." Clara couldn't help raising an eyebrow. "That's not the answer I usually hear." I've learned clear thinking has saved me more often than quick shooting. She set the bowl of stew before him. Name: Elias Boone. I'm Clara Whitmore. Instead of reacting with surprise at finding a woman running the entire establishment alone, Elias simply nodded. It's a pleasure, Miss Whitmore. That small gesture caught her off guard. Most strangers eventually asked where her husband was. Others assumed one would appear soon enough. Elias asked neither. He accepted the meal with quiet gratitude and ate slowly, as though every bite deserved appreciation after days on the trail. For several minutes, the only sounds were the crackling stove and the wind pushing against the windows. Finally, Clara spoke. Passing through Red Creek? I thought I was. And now? Elias looked into his coffee before answering. I'm not certain anymore. The honesty of the reply surprised her. Most travelers always claimed to know exactly where they were headed. This man sounded like someone still searching for a reason to stop. Outside, across the snow-covered street, another pair of eyes watched the boarding house through the frosted window of a large office, hand resting against the glass. The wealthy lumber merchant had spent years buying property throughout Red Creek, and there was only one building left standing between him and the expansion he envisioned. Whitmore Boarding House. He watched the stranger settle comfortably inside. Watched Clara sit for a moment across the table from him. Watched the quiet conversation begin. His expression hardened. Turning toward the two men waiting inside his office, Horace spoke without taking his eyes off the boarding house. Keep an eye on that newcomer. One of the men looked toward the window. You expecting trouble, Mr. Granger? Horace's lips formed a thin smile. I've learned something over the years. He buttoned his coat before reaching for his hat. The most dangerous strangers aren't the loud ones. He looked back across the snowy street one final time. They're the ones who quietly decide to stay. The storm finally settled sometime after midnight, leaving Red Creek wrapped in a deep, silent blanket of snow. Inside the boarding house, every lamp had been extinguished except the small one burning in the kitchen. Clara had finished balancing the day's ledger and climbed upstairs, grateful for the quiet. Elias had retired to the room at the end of the hallway, and before long the old house seemed to breathe with the calm that only winter nights could bring. That peace lasted less than an hour. A loud crash shattered the silence. Clara's eyes flew open. Another heavy thud followed, then the frightened squawking of chickens outside. She grabbed the lantern beside her bed and hurried downstairs just as Elias stepped into the hallway, already pulling on his coat. You heard it too? She asked. He nodded once. Stay inside. I own this place, Clara replied firmly. I'm not hiding from whatever's out there. Without arguing, Elias picked up the lantern hanging near the front door while Clara unlocked it. The icy wind rushed inside. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they crossed the yard. The sight waiting for them made Clara stop. The chicken coop had been smashed apart. Wooden boards lay scattered across the yard. Feathers drifted across the snow, and frightened hens wandered in every direction. Just beyond the coop, the hand-operated water pump had been broken clean off its base, leaving frozen water spreading across the ground like glass. The fence surrounding the stable had also been torn down in two places. Someone hadn't come to steal. They had come to send a message. Elias crouched beside one of the broken posts. No wagon tracks, he said quietly. Only horses. He brushed fresh snow aside with his glove. 3 riders. You can tell that? They weren't trying to hide it. Clara's jaw tightened. Near the shattered pump, a folded piece of paper had been pinned beneath a broken board. She picked it up. Only 5 words were written across it. Sell before winter ends. She didn't need a signature. She already knew who had sent it. Horace, she whispered. Elias looked at her. This isn't the first time. No. She folded the note carefully instead of tearing it apart. It's simply the boldest. He studied her face. I suppose the sheriff should see that. He will. Clara expected anger to rise inside her. Instead, she felt something colder. Determination. Her uncle had stood against bullies his entire life. She refused to be the one who surrendered what he had built. The eastern sky had barely begun to brighten when Elias was already carrying lumber from the storage shed. You don't have to do that, Clara called from the porch. He glanced up. I know. You paid for a room, not a day's work. I also paid for a place where people deserve to wake up without finding everything broken. Before she could argue further, he began fitting new boards together. By sunrise, the fence was standing again. The broken coop had been repaired well enough to keep the chickens safe from the cold. The damaged pump took longer. Elias spent nearly 2 hours dismantling the frozen mechanism before replacing the cracked iron rod with one he'd shaped from spare steel in the workshop behind the stable. When Clara finally tested the handle, clear water poured into the bucket. She looked at him. "You've done this before. I've fixed worse." She reached into her apron pocket and offered several silver coins. "For your time." He gently pushed her hand back. "I wasn't looking for payment. You earned it." "I know. So why refuse?" He smiled faintly. "Because sometimes helping is enough." Clara slipped the coins back in her pocket. She wasn't accustomed to accepting favors, but something told her refusing this one would only insult him. By lunchtime, word of the vandalism had spread across Red Creek. Neighbors stopped by to ask questions. Some shook their heads sympathetically. Others quietly advised Clara to accept Horace Granger's offer before things became worse. Mrs. Eleanor Pike arrived carrying a basket of fresh apple muffins. She had lived in Red Creek longer than almost anyone and considered it her duty to know everyone's business. She set the basket on the kitchen counter before looking through the dining room window toward Elias, who was repairing another loose shutter. "Handsome fellow," she observed. Clara rolled her eyes. "He's a guest." "So he is." Mrs. Pike smiled knowingly. "And somehow your guest has rebuilt half the yard before breakfast." "He simply dislikes broken things." The older woman chuckled. "Some men run from work." She nodded toward Elias. "That one seems to walk straight toward it." Clara pretended not to hear the deeper meaning. The afternoon passed quietly. Travelers came and went. Railroad workers filled the dining room during supper. Elias helped carry heavy sacks of flour into the pantry without being asked. Later he stacked chairs after closing while Clara updated the accounts. It felt strangely natural, as though he had been part of the boarding house much longer than a single day. The following morning brought another surprise. Clara found smoke rising from the kitchen before she had even lit the stove. She hurried inside. Elias stood over a skillet, wearing an expression of complete concentration. "What are you doing?" He looked over his shoulder. "Making breakfast." She stared at the blackened pan. "I see that. I may have underestimated your stove. You've burned the bacon." "I noticed. And the eggs. They'll recover." She laughed despite herself. "They most certainly won't." He scratched the back of his neck. "I've spent more time repairing barns than cooking in kitchens." That explains a great deal. Together they salvaged what little they could. The bacon became food for the farm dogs. Fresh eggs replaced the ruined ones. When breakfast was finally served, both of them were smiling. Mrs. Pike took one bite of a biscuit before narrowing her eyes. "Who baked these?" Elias slowly raised his hand. She chewed thoughtfully. "They're not terrible." He looked relieved. "They're considerably worse than terrible," Clara said with a grin. Mrs. Pike laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. "I'll tell you one thing," she said, pointing first at Clara and then at Elias. "You two keep this up, and by the time spring reaches Red Creek, folks won't remember when this boarding house ever belonged to just one person." Clara immediately returned to her ledger, pretending the warmth rising to her cheeks came from the kitchen stove. Across town, inside his office, Horace Granger received word that every bit of damage had already been repaired. His expression darkened. "So," he muttered, staring out at the boarding house once again, "the stranger isn't just passing through." His fingers tightened around the arm of his chair. "That," he said quietly, "changes everything." Winter settled gently over Red Creek, covering rooftops, fences, and pine trees beneath layers of fresh snow. The storms became less frequent, and life found a comfortable rhythm. Travelers still came through the boarding house. Railroad crews still filled the dining room every evening, and the smell of fresh bread drifted on a main street long before sunrise. For the first time in years, Clara realized she wasn't carrying every responsibility alone. Not because she had asked anyone to, because Elias simply noticed what needed doing before she ever mentioned it. One cold morning, She stepped outside with a bucket of grain only to find the stable already swept clean. The horses had been fed. Firewood had been stacked neatly beside the kitchen door. Fresh water waited in every trough. She found Elias repairing a loose wagon wheel for one of the regular guests. "You've been awake since before daylight again," she said. He shrugged. "I've never been very good at sleeping late." "Neither have I. That's probably why this place opens on time every morning." She smiled without realizing it. It had become surprisingly easy to smile around him. December brought Christmas preparations to the little frontier town. Garlands of evergreen appeared across storefronts. Children gathered pine cones from nearby hills, and every Saturday evening neighbors met in the church hall to make simple decorations for the coming holiday. Clara volunteered the boarding house dining room for one afternoon of candlemaking. The place filled with laughter. Children dipped strings into melted wax, while older women exchanged recipes and stories from years gone by. Elias sat awkwardly at the end of one table, trying to carve wooden candle holders. His first attempt leaned noticeably to one side. Young Tommy Reed, no older than 8, picked it up and examined it carefully. "Mr. Boone, yes, I think your candle holder is crooked." Elias looked at it thoughtfully. "I was hoping nobody would notice." Tommy grinned. "I noticed. So did I." Without missing a beat, Elias handed it to the boy. "Then I suppose it belongs to the man with the sharpest eyes in Red Creek." The room erupted with laughter. Even Clara had to cover her mouth to hide her smile. A few days later, the first heavy snowfall arrived. Children gathered outside the boarding house, throwing snowballs at one another. Elias had just finished unloading supplies when one bounced harmlessly against his shoulder. He looked around dramatically. Who started a war? Within seconds, 3 more snowballs came flying. Instead of scolding the children, he scooped up a handful of snow and fired one back with remarkable accuracy. Soon half the town square had become a battlefield. Clara stepped onto the porch carrying fresh towels, only to receive a snowball squarely against her coat. She stared at Elias. "You did that on purpose." "I was aiming for the porch post." "You missed by 6 feet." "I admitted I was aiming." She laughed and bent to gather snow herself. For the next 10 minutes, neither of them cared who was watching. When they finally returned inside, both were soaked and laughing harder than either had in years. Mrs. Eleanor Pike happened to witness the entire affair from across the street. She shook her head knowingly. "Those two are pretending not to fall in love." The blacksmith beside her chuckled. "You think they know?" "Oh, they know. They're simply taking the scenic route." The weeks passed in small moments that quietly stitched 2 separate lives together. Some evenings, after the last guests had gone upstairs, Clara would bring out one of her Uncle Benjamin's old journals. The pages were filled with stories about the early days of Red Creek. Hard winters, cattle drives, floods, and hopeful plans for the future. Elias listened carefully while she read aloud beside the fireplace. He believed this town would become something worth staying for, Clara said one night. Looks like he was right. She looked at him. "You say that like someone who's thinking about staying." He stared into the fire. "I'm trying not to think too far ahead." She understood there was more behind those words than he wished to explain, so she let the silence remain. Not every conversation needed an answer. Christmas Eve brought the annual community supper. Families crowded into the church hall carrying pies, roasted turkey, vegetables, and homemade desserts. Someone pushed the tables aside after dinner. An old fiddle player began a cheerful tune. One couple after another stepped onto the wooden floor. Mrs. Pike appeared beside Clara with a mischievous smile. "You've been standing against that wall long enough." "I don't dance." "Nonsense." Before Clara could protest further, Mrs. Pike turned toward Elias. "Mr. Boone." He looked up from his coffee. "You appear to have 2 perfectly good feet. I've never been accused of using them gracefully." "Neither has Clara." The older woman folded her arms. "So you'll make a fine pair." The room filled with encouraging laughter. Clara sighed dramatically. "We're being ambushed." "It certainly feels that way," Elias agreed. With no polite escape remaining, he offered his hand. "If we embarrass ourselves, we do it together." She placed her hand in his. "Agreed." Neither possessed much talent for dancing. They missed steps, turned the wrong direction, nearly collided with another couple twice. At one point, Elias apologized after accidentally stepping on Clara's boot. She laughed. If that's your greatest mistake tonight, you're doing remarkably well. By the final song, they had stopped worrying about getting the steps right. They simply enjoyed the music. Several townspeople smiled quietly as they watched. It wasn't a grand romance. There were no dramatic declarations. Only two people gradually discovering that happiness often arrived in ordinary moments. A few evenings later, while cleaning the attic, Clara uncovered an old cedar chest that had belonged to her uncle. Inside were faded survey maps, handwritten notes, and legal documents tied together with worn blue ribbon. Curious, she carried them downstairs. As she unfolded the largest map across the dining room table, Elias came over to look. "This isn't just property records," he said. Clara traced one finger across the yellowed paper until it stopped at a marked circle beyond the boarding house. Her eyes widened. "The spring. What about it? My uncle never owned this land because it was valuable." She looked at Elias, realization slowly settling across her face. He protected it because this natural spring supplies fresh water to nearly every ranch east of Red Creek. Elias studied the survey carefully, meaning whoever controls that spring controls far more than one piece of property. Clara nodded slowly. For months she had believed Horace Granger simply wanted another building lot. Now she understood the truth. The boarding house had never been his real prize. The spring hidden beyond it was. Outside, snow continued to fall quietly over Red Creek. Inside, Clara carefully folded the old survey map back into its ribbon. Neither she nor Elias spoke for several moments. Both understood the peaceful weeks of winter might soon be coming to an end. The trouble arrived before sunrise on a bitter January morning. Elias was the first to hear it. The sound of horses. Not one or two riders passing through town, but several moving together with purpose. He pulled back the curtain of his room and saw lanterns flickering beyond the trees behind the boarding house. Shadows moved around the path, leading toward the natural spring. By the time he reached the kitchen, Clara was already fastening her winter coat. "You heard them," she said. He nodded. "Horace isn't waiting for another offer." Together they stepped onto the back porch. Four mounted men stood near the spring, carrying shovels and wooden stakes. Others had begun stretching ropes across the narrow path, as though preparing to claim the land before daylight. One of the men drove a sign into the frozen ground. "Property of Granger Lumber Company." Clara looked at it without flinching. "That sign doesn't make it true." Elias rested a hand on the fence rail, studying the men. "They're hoping we'll lose our tempers, so they can claim we attacked them." He nodded. "They want to fight." She looked at him carefully. "What do we do?" For several long seconds he said nothing. Years earlier, the answer would have been simple. Draw a gun. Drive them away. Let the strongest man win. But that version of Elias Boone had already cost too many innocent people their homes. He shook his head. "We're not giving Horace what he wants." Clara smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Instead of reaching for rifles, she hurried back inside. From the bottom drawer of her uncle's old desk, she removed a leather folder tied with faded blue ribbon. Inside were decades of carefully preserved records. Original survey maps, tax receipts, water right agreements, signed property boundaries. Every document Benjamin Whitmore had ever refused to throw away. "I knew these would matter someday," Clara said. Elias looked through the papers. "This is enough to prove ownership. It proves more than that." She unfolded another map across the kitchen table. "My uncle registered the spring as a shared water source for neighboring ranches." Elias looked up. "So Horace isn't trying to steal from just one family. He's threatening half the valley." Clara wasted no time. She sent young Tommy Reed racing to fetch the sheriff. Another message went to the town clerk. A third to Reverend Collins. By noon, nearly everyone who depended upon the spring had been asked to come to the council hall. Word spread through Red Creek faster than the winter wind. By afternoon, the meeting room was overflowing. Ranchers, merchants, teachers, railroad workers, families who had drawn water from that spring for years. Horace Granger arrived dressed in his finest wool coat, wearing the same confident smile that had intimidated the town for more than a decade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, I'm simply correcting an old property mistake. Clara stood. No. The room fell silent. She carried the leather folder to the center table. My uncle documented every agreement concerning this land. One by one she laid out the original survey, the official county seal, tax records dating back 20 years, water right contracts signed by neighboring ranch owners. Every page supported the next. Horace's smile slowly disappeared. He produced his own document. This deed clearly includes the spring. Clara examined it for only a few seconds. The county changed its seal 12 years ago. She held the paper up for everyone to see. This document uses the newer seal, but claims it was signed 18 years ago. Several people leaned forward. The town clerk adjusted his spectacles before taking the page. After a long examination, he looked toward the council. It's forged. A murmur swept through the room. Horace tried another argument. The spring isn't being used efficiently. It belongs to the community, Clara answered calmly. It was never meant to become one man's business. Then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Eleanor Pike slowly rose from the front row. I'd like to say something. No one interrupted. She faced the council. My husband watered our cattle from that spring until the day he died. She pointed toward Horace. This man's offered money to nearly every family sitting here. Several heads nodded. He always wanted that water. One after another, townspeople stood. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, 3 ranch owners, even the railroad foreman. Each told nearly the same story. Pressure, threats, repeated offers, promises that became warnings after every refusal. The room grew quieter with every testimony. Horace looked around and realized something had changed. For years people had feared standing alone. Today they weren't alone anymore. Sheriff Daniel Mercer entered just as the final witness finished speaking. He carried the forged deed in one hand. I've heard enough. 2 deputies stepped beside Horace. You'll answer questions about document fraud and attempted seizure of protected property. Horace stared at Clara. This isn't over. She met his gaze steadily. I believe it is. Without another word, the deputies escorted him from the hall. No one followed. No one defended him. By spring, investigations into his business uncovered years of dishonest dealings. Several illegal land purchases were overturned. His lumber company lost major contracts. Within months, Horace Granger quietly sold what remained of his interests and left Red Creek without ceremony. The town hardly noticed his departure. Life had become too busy moving forward. One evening in early April, Elias sat alone on the boarding house porch holding a folded envelope. The job offer from Colorado still rested inside. Higher wages, a fresh start, the sort of opportunity he once would have accepted without hesitation. Clara stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. You've been staring at that letter for an hour. I know. She sat beside him. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I know. He looked toward the boarding house. Guests laughed inside. The kitchen windows glowed warmly. Children chased one another across the yard. For the first time in many years, it felt like home. I spent most of my life believing staying somewhere made a man weak, he said quietly. Clara waited. I think I finally understand. Understand what? He smiled. It isn't staying that's difficult. It's believing you've found somewhere worth staying. Without another word, he unfolded the letter. Instead of reading it again, he dropped it into the small fire burning inside the porch stove. The paper curled, blackened, and disappeared into ash. Clara reached for his hand. So, Elias replied with a grin, I suppose I should finally unpack the rest of my saddlebags. She laughed. I was beginning to wonder if you ever would. A month later, a freshly painted wooden sign was raised above the entrance. Whitmore House Boarding Inn. The grand opening brought nearly the entire town together. Children ran across the yard. Fresh bread disappeared almost as quickly as it came from the oven. Mrs. Pike proudly announced to anyone willing to listen that she had predicted the outcome months earlier. As the celebration came to an end, Clara and Elias stood alone on the front porch. The evening sun painted the Montana hills in shades of gold. The boarding house behind them buzzed with laughter and conversation. Clara looked at the life they had built together. I spent years proving I could carry every burden myself. Elias squeezed her hand gently. And you could. She smiled. But it's a finer life when someone chooses to carry the weight beside you. Not because you need saving, but because you've built something worth sharing. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light settle over Red Creek, knowing that the strongest foundations were never built by force, but by trust, patience, and two people choosing, day after day, to stay.